Today we're actually looking at the final part of the General Stipulations of the treaty document that constitutes the book of Devarim. There are various ways of counting the number of mitzvot or commandments that we find in this parashah. I count 45, and I'll give you a list that you can take with you, while the Rabbinical Judaism established that there are 74. However, we divide the actual number of mitzvot, we find that it contains far more commands and rulings than any other parashah in the whole of Torah. There is not time to go through all 45 of them. Instead, I want to focus today on one topic, the firstborn. That one subject expresses a great deal of how Yahweh wanted Israel to behave when they entered the land of Canaan. It also establishes the background against which we can measure how Yahweh dealt with Israel as his people in his land of promise, both in ancient times and even now in modern times. So let's look at the firstborn. Devarim chapter 21 sets out an ordered pathway for the inheritance of the land as it passed on from generation to generation. And in verses 15 through 17, Moshe says, "If a man has two wives, and both the loved and the unloved wives have borne him children, and if the firstborn son is the child of the unloved wife, then when it comes time for him to pass on his inheritance, he may not give his inheritance due to the firstborn to the son of the loved wife, in place of the son of the unloved one. No, he must acknowledge that the firstborn son of the unloved wife by giving him the double portion of everything he owns, for he is the first fruits of his manhood, and the right of firstborn is his." When Moshe gave the instruction to Israel, they were on the brink of actually entering into the land of Canaan. So once they had displaced all the occupying people, they were to divide up all the land according to the size of each of the tribes. As Israel was totally an agricultural society, it meant ownership of the land was of paramount importance. That was because the livelihood of each family unit or clan depended totally upon what the land would produce. Each successive generation had to pass on the rights of ownership to enable their extended family to continue to enjoy the fruits of their labors. Hence, the firstborn had to receive a double portion of his father's wealth and property, regardless of what the other members of the family felt or desired. That way, Yahweh was ensuring that the inheritance of the property in Israel would always remain in the ownership of the clan and tribe to which it was originally assigned. Now, by giving the command set forth in verses 15 through 17, Yahweh is taking the burden off the choice off the shoulders of the father in each generation. He does not have to decide whom he's going to give it to. It is done for him. No father could choose one son ahead of another, because if the choice as to whom he would be his rightful heir in each generation would often end up in family feuds, because the father may decide upon one child or one son, and others in the family feel they had the rights, but Yahweh determined the real rights. Not only was it a privilege for the firstborn to inherit the double portion, it was also carried a responsibility upon the firstborn to ensure that the ownership remained intact, which was a viable benefit for the whole of the community, and particularly for that family unit. The narrative in verses 15 through 16 shows that regardless of the family dynamics the firstborn had to receive that double portion. There was no room for personal favoritism in relation to land ownership. Now let's step back in history and go back to the three patriarchs. By contrast with what we have just been considering, we see in the book of Bereshit or Genesis, in the three generations, the firstborn son was passed over by Yahweh in favor of another son. Starting with Abraham, his firstborn son Ishmael was passed over in favor of Yitzhak. Then Yahweh decides to pass over Esau, Yitzhak's firstborn son, in favor of Yaakov. Finally, at the end of Yaakov's life, the third patriarch, rather than pass the mantle on to Reuben, who is his firstborn son, Yaakov selects Yosef, his 11th son, to receive the double portion. Even then, Yaakov himself passed the mantle of the firstborn beyond Yosef himself and gave it to Yosef's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And they were born in that order, Manasseh first, Ephraim second. Yet Yaakov reversed the order of seniority by selecting Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Ephraim received the firstborn blessing. In each situation, the choice of the one to receive the double portion caused a great deal of sibling rivalry and dispute. Even at the age of 17, Yosef was favored by his father ahead of his other brothers. Hence, Yosef was hated by his 10 half-brothers, and it resulted in them selling him into slavery. Their action brought them profound benefit, not only to themselves, but also to the rest of the family, after approximately 30 years. During their interim period, it caused both Yaakov and the rest of the family a great deal of heartache and stress. Since Yahweh did not choose the firstborn from any generation in the time of the patriarchs, we must ask then, why did he insist that Israel select only the actual firstborn for each generation after Israel crossed the Yarden? The answer lies in a case of role and responsibility. When Israel entered the land of Canaan, the role was to ensure continuity of the tribal and family structure through each subsequent generation. Whereas in the time of the patriarchs, the role was focused solely on selecting the correct person for the development of the community of Israel, so that it would follow the sovereign plan of God. The choices Yahweh made during the generations of patriarchs were basically solely on character choice rather than position of birth. Even though they were living in the land that was promised to Abram, they were actually still nomads in the midst of the other people groups that also inhabited the land of Canaan. However, when Israel returned under the leadership of Yehoshua, they were taking possession of the land, and they would live there as long as Yahweh was prepared to leave them, provided they followed his Mitzvot. Now let's move on and consider love and hate. Turning again to Devarim 21 verse 15, there are two Hebrew words behind the English translation that need careful consideration. They are Ahavah, meaning loved, and Sinuvah, meaning unloved. Both words are used in the one verse and are completely in keeping with the narrative we've been considering. One wife was loved and the other was unloved. However, Sinuvah has often been mistranslated as hated, which invokes an unduly harsh emotion. Now, the use of the word hate first appeared in the King James Version and was subsequently adopted by a number of the modern English translations. The use of the word hated in that context gives a distorted impression. Why did he not give the hated wife a divorce? Now, if she was unloved or loved less in the relationship than the other, then the marriage could remain stable. A scriptural example in Bereshit chapter 29 is where we see the relationship between Yaakov and Rachel, whom he loved from the moment he met her at the well. However, having been tricked by his father-in-law Lavan, Yaakov accepted Leah as his wife, but even though he had not chosen her as his bride, Scripture tells us that she remained unloved, but she also remained as his wife. Yosef was 17 years old when Yaakov favored him ahead of his brothers. Later in Bereshit chapter 48, near the end of Yaakov's life, he again favors Yosef by giving him the firstborn status, because he was the firstborn of Rachel. That was the classic situation of favoring the son of the loved wife ahead of the firstborn, who really was Reuben, who was the firstborn son of the unloved wife. So Yaakov was doing exactly what God had said he shouldn't do. As I showed earlier, while Yaakov loved Rachel and did not love Leah, it also happened that Yahweh foresaw the family dynamics. It was a matter of selecting the correct son for the role that lay ahead. And when we consider the character of the sons of Yaakov, it becomes apparent that Yahweh selected Yosef ahead of his half-brothers. The whole scenario is a clear example of how the Spirit of God worked through the mind and heart of Yaakov in making the choice that he did. Now let's move on and consider King David. In 1 Kings chapter 1, we have yet another graphic example of a family feud when David was dying. The whole matter arose over which son, in accordance with Devarim chapter 21 verses 15 through 17, should have been the one who was the rightful heir of the throne of Israel. It should have been Adoniah, the son of Haggith. By the time David lay dying, 3 sons had already died, so Adoniah was the next in line as the firstborn, even though he was the 4th son of David. But Bathsheba says, "My Lord, you swore by Yahweh your God to your servant Nathan that your son Shlomo would be king after you. He will sit on my throne. But now here is Adoniah ruling as king, and you, my lord, the king, do not even know anything about it." David had sworn an oath that Shlomo was going to be king after him. But if we reflect back on 2 Samuel chapter 12 verses 24 and 25, we see there that Yahweh also favored Shlomo ahead of David's elder sons. In those verses, he said, David confronted his wife Bathsheba and went to bed with her, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Shlomo. Yahweh loved him and sent message through Nathan the prophet to have him named loved by God for the sake of Yahweh. Through the foreknowledge, Yahweh favored Shlomo ahead of the older half-brother Adoniah. Also, David made an oath that Shlomo would become the king, and the oath was honored by Yahweh. Here we again see the situation where Yahweh favored the selection of someone other than the natural firstborn. But just as with the 3 patriarchs, it was a matter of character, not land inheritance, that was the overriding factor in the choice being made. So let's consider the right choices. With those thoughts in mind, we need to acknowledge that there has always been a tension between fathers wanting to make a personal choice and the need for the common good of the people. Our personal choice is often driven by the words, "The wealth and property are mine, so I get to choose whom I want to be my inheritor." But with Yahweh, there is always the welfare of others to consider. The others can include other siblings, members of the wider family, even the wider community. All those can be damaged by family disputes over the rights of inheritance. Yahweh was right in allowing Moshe to give a definitive command regarding the firstborn inheritance. That was the message that was given to that second generation of Israel, and they needed that because they were just about to inherit the land of promise. Giving the double portion to that natural born son was always going to be imposed, regardless of the personal desires of the father. Consequently, we see that the three examples in Bereshit, Yahweh himself chooses another in each situation. While that was the prerogative of Yahweh, he also exercised it because of the necessity to have the right character for the development of Israel. In each situation, the land inheritance was not the driving force in the time of the patriarchs. Instead, the development of his chosen people was what needed the one with the right character to lead the whole of that next generation forward. That feature is borne out in the selections that were made when we compare the firstborn male alongside the one that was chosen. Starting with Abraham, Ishmael was set aside in favor of Yitzhak. Esau was set aside in favor of Yaakov, and Reuben was set aside in favor of Yosef. All three choices helped to progress the development of Israel as the people who would fulfill that promise of land inheritance that Yahweh had given to Abraham. Later, we see that Yahweh chose Moshe, who had actually spent 40 years in exile in Midian after murdering an Egyptian. Later, he chooses Yehoshua as the one to lead Israel into the land, not because he had any special rights as firstborn or otherwise, but because he showed a righteous character by returning a good report about the land. So let's look at Yeshua as the firstborn. First consideration of the firstborn we see in the Brit Hadashah is found in Luke chapter 2, verse 22, where the purification of Miriam, the mother of Yeshua, is taking place with the offering of a pair of doves at the temple. It was for her purification after the birth, and also the consecration of Yeshua as the firstborn son. This was done in accordance with the commands of Torah. In that process, there is no selection taking place. Instead, it's simply a matter of confirming the commands of Torah, that each firstborn male had to be consecrated before Yahweh. In and of itself, it is proof that the place of the firstborn male in Israel held a very special place alongside his siblings in each generation. So what does Shaul say regarding the firstborn? The next mention of firstborn, as we read, is in Romans chapter 8, verse 29, where we see Yeshua is referred to as the firstborn among his many brothers. Then, in verse 14, it says, all who are led by God's Spirit are God's sons. Those words were spoken to those who were being called out between Shavuot 30 CE and the destruction of the Second Temple. But many people, both men and women, have been led by God's Spirit throughout the last 1900 plus years. All who have heeded that call have been joined in with the many brothers of Yeshua in accordance with verse 29. However, at no stage during that prolonged period has our Heavenly Father ever sought another firstborn, nor has he chosen someone other than Yeshua to lead the brothers into the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, we must see that the whole period of 1900 plus years as one generation. In verses 14 through 39, Shaul is grappling with this whole concept of what it means to be sons of God. He sees all are called to be joint heirs with the Messiah and brothers of Yeshua. Now, what about the firstborn from the dead? Shaul yet again changes the concept of the firstborn in Colossians chapter 1 verses 18 through 20, where he says about Yeshua, he is the head of the body, the Messianic community. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might hold the first place in everything. Pleased God to have his full being live in his Son, and through his Son to reconcile everything to himself, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace through him, and through having his Son shed his blood by being executed on a stake. Now, these words of Shaul sum up the whole reason why God formed Israel from one man, Abraham, and why he chose whom he wanted to ensure that through every generation the right man would lead people towards nationhood. Finally, Yochanan in Revelation gives us the full meaning of the phrase firstborn from the dead when he says in Revelation 1 verses 4 and 5, grace and shalom to you from the one who is, who was, and who is coming, from the sevenfold Spirit before the throne, and from Yeshua the Messiah, the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, and the ruler of earth's kings. So in conclusion, having looked at just a small portion of this week's Parashah, we can see clearly that Moshe was instructed that every father had to give his firstborn the double portion of the family's inheritance, so that the land would always remain in the possession of the tribe. We saw also how Yahweh chose other sons for each of the three patriarchs rather than the natural firstborn, with the reason that Yahweh was selecting a suitable character for the development of Israel. We saw also in the time of David, Yahweh again chose whom he wanted to succeed on the throne as the next king. Again, it was the character that was the driving force of choosing one ahead of the natural firstborn. Now, having fully established his people, Israel, God finally chose his own son, Yeshua. In that special way, as we read in Colossians, it pleased God to have his full being live in his Son, and through his Son reconcile to himself all things. We saw that the ultimate place of the firstborn was brought about through the death of Yeshua, who became the firstborn from the dead. Through death, all humanity can be brought back into a relationship with the God of heaven. Finally, Shaul showed that all who are called and led by the Spirit of God become sons of God, with Yeshua as the firstborn. Therefore, as Talmudim of Yeshua, we can rest upon God's assurance that providing we hold fast to Yeshua and the teachings of Torah, we will be blessed with a place in the kingdom of heaven as sons of God. Shabbat Shalom.